The tractor turned over twice before catching. Not the clean diesel rhythm Sarah Williams had heard for 3 decades, something rougher, a sound that didn't belong. She killed the engine. The silence that followed felt wrong heavy in a way that made her hands tighten on the steering wheel. February cold bit through the cab's cracked windows. Across the field, the farmhouse sat small against the Iowa sky, smoke rising from the chimney where Mark would be making breakfast, where Emma would be hunched over chemistry homework, earbuds blocking out the world. 30 years? Every single morning this machine had started. 30 years of mornings that began in darkness of frost on metal and breath visible in headlight beams. The John Deere 4020 was 53 years old, built in 1972, when tractors were designed to outlast the people who drove them. No computers, no software locks, just iron and diesel, and the kind of engineering that assumed a farmer should understand every part of the machine they owned. Sarah climbed down, boots hitting frozen ground. She pulled the hood open. The engine compartment was familiar as her own hands, every bolt, every line, every component mapped in her memory from years of maintenance she'd done herself. Oil changes every spring, fuel filters before planting, valve adjustments when the sound told her something needed attention. No warning lights, no diagnostic codes, just experience and the willingness to get grease under your fingernails. She found the problem in less than 10 minutes. The injector nozzle casting had worn through. 53 years of heat cycles and diesel combustion had finally taken their toll. Normal wear, expected even. She wiped her hands on a rag, allowed herself a small smile. This would be easy, maybe 2 hours, $50 for the part. She already had the part number memorized from the service manual she'd kept since 1995, a B1621. 1R, a simple injection nozzle used across John Deere's entire 4000 series. Thousands of them had been made. Thousands were still running on farms across Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri. Drive to town, stop by the dealership, pay for the part, back in the field before lunch. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she was wrong about the easy part. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Mark Williams sat at the wooden table with a calculator and a stack of envelopes. The February light came through the window, pale and weak, but his focus was sharp. Property tax due in March. Seed prices up 18% from last year. Fuel costs climbing every month. He looked up when Sarah came through the door, reading her face the way he'd learned to read it over 26 years of marriage. How bad? Sarah pulled off her work gloves, set them on the counter. Injector nozzle casting wore out. Mark's shoulders relaxed slightly. His pen hovered over the checkbook. How much? Maybe $50, 2 hours work. He nodded and went back to the bills. $50 was nothing. A relief, actually. They just paid off the farm 2 years ago. 28 years of mortgage payments finally done. The first time in their adult lives they truly owned the land they worked. No bank, no monthly payment hanging over their heads. The freedom of it still felt new. Emma Williams sat across from her father, earbuds and chemistry homework spread out in front of her. 15 years old, junior year starting next fall. She looked up briefly when her mother came in, then went back to her textbook. The morning tractor sounds were as routine to her as bird song. Sarah headed to the shop. The service manual sat on the shelf where she'd kept it since 1995, spine cracked from used pages worn soft at the edges. She pulled it down and flipped to the fuel system section. There it was, a B1621R injection nozzle assembly. The margins held her own notes in faded pencil from previous maintenance. Last replaced 2001. Torque spec 45 foot-pounds, thread compound on installation. The part number was burned into her memory now. She'd ordered from this manual a dozen times over the years. Emma appeared in the shop doorway, chemistry book still in hand. What part? Sarah held up her thumb and forefinger, spacing them about an inch apart. Injector nozzle. About this big. Emma stepped closer, squinting at the diagram in the service manual. That little thing stopped the whole tractor. Every part matters, even the smallest ones. The girl studied the schematic for a moment. Then her face shifted to that expression Sarah had seen more often lately. The look that said she was thinking about something beyond the immediate question. Why don't we just buy a new tractor? Sarah closed the manual carefully. Because this one works fine. But it's old, like older than you. New doesn't mean better, and this one's paid for. Emma didn't push it further, but the question hung in the air after she left. Sarah knew where it came from. The girl's classmates, probably. Kids whose families had newer equipment, bigger operations, more debt. They didn't understand yet. The memory came without warning, sharp as broken glass. Sarah at 15 watching strangers walk through her father's machine shed. The auction. 1990. James Peterson had lost the farm to John Deere Credit after 3 bad harvests and interest rates that climbed faster than corn prices. The bank took everything, the land her grandfather had broken with horses in 1947, the equipment James had maintained with the same care Sarah now gave to the 4020. She'd watched her father shrink after that, depression settling over him like Iowa winter. 5 years of watching him fade. The letter was still in her desk drawer, unopened since 1995. The one the county sheriff had found. The one Sarah had never had the courage to read. She knew what it said. You didn't need to read the words to know what a man was thinking when he walked into his own barn and didn't walk out. The same year Sarah bought this tractor with money saved from working 3 jobs. The same year she married Mark. The same year she swore on her father's grave that no corporation would ever own her labor again. The Greenfield John Deere dealership sat on the edge of town where the county road met Highway 20. The building had been remodeled sometime in the last decade, polished concrete floors, bright overhead lights, walls of green and yellow branding. New tractors lined the showroom like machines in a museum. A 6M series sat in the center position, spotlights making the paint gleam. Digital display in the cab, GPS mapping system, touchscreen controls. The price tag hung from the roll bar, $185,000. Sarah walked past it to the parts counter in the back. A man in his early 40s stood behind the computer terminal polo shirt with the John Deere logo embroidered over the pocket. His nameplate read Jason Cole. He looked up when Sarah approached and his expression was friendly, professional. Help you find something. Sarah handed him the paper with the part number written on it. Need one of these. Jason typed the number into the system. His eyes moved across the screen. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly and he leaned back in his chair. That's for a 4020, right? Sarah nodded. Jason tapped the keyboard again. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that Sarah noticed. The friendliness didn't disappear exactly, but something else crept in underneath it. Something rehearsed. That part's discontinued. The word landed wrong. Sarah had been around equipment long enough to know when something sounded off. Discontinued. Yeah, too old, not available anymore. Sarah didn't move. Parts didn't just disappear, especially parts used in thousands of tractors across the country. You sure about that? Jason shrugged, the gesture casual, practiced. That's what the system says. He paused, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that felt almost sympathetic. You could ask around, other dealerships maybe, but honestly, he left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Then the conversation shifted. Suddenly, Jason wasn't talking about parts anymore. He was talking about something else entirely. Trade-ins, new equipment, financing options. Honestly, Jason said, leaning forward with the confidence of someone who'd made this pitch 100 times, you'd probably be better off upgrading anyway. He gestured toward the 6M under the lights. That tractor would make your life a lot easier. GPS auto steer, touchscreen controls, diagnostic system that tells you exactly what's wrong before anything breaks down. Sarah glanced at the price tag again. $185,000, payment plan available, 7 years interest included. She did the math silently. The mortgage they'd just paid off had taken 28 years. This would put them right back where they'd started, except worse because at least land held value. Equipment depreciated the moment you drove it off the lot. She shook her head. I just need the nozzle. Jason sighed, tapping the computer screen like it held authority neither of them could question. Like I said, that part doesn't exist anymore. Sarah left the dealership with her hands shaking, not from cold from anger, the kind that builds slow and stays. Something about the whole interaction felt wrong, rehearsed, like Jason had been waiting for someone to ask about old parts just so he could deliver that exact script. You could ask around, but honestly, what did that mean? Honestly, what? The drive home took longer than usual. Sarah kept replaying the conversation. Parts used in thousands of tractors didn't simply vanish from existence, but dealerships had computers. Computers were supposed to know more than people, except computers only knew what someone programmed them to know. Back in the kitchen, Mark looked up from his bills when she walked in empty-handed. What happened? They say the part doesn't exist. He set down his pen. How can it not exist? Sarah sat down across from him. The calculator still showed the farm's monthly expenses on its small screen. They want me to buy a new tractor, $185,000. The silence stretched between them. Mark's hand moved to the stack of paid-off mortgage papers they kept in the drawer. 28 years of payments finished 2 years ago, the relief of it still fresh. We just got out of debt. I know. Emma appeared in the doorway home from school. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand something was wrong. They won't sell you the part. Sarah shook her head. They say it doesn't exist anymore. But you said thousands of those tractors are still running. That's what I thought too. The girl's face showed confusion, then something else. The first recognition that adults didn't always tell the truth, that systems didn't always work the way they claimed to. But there was something else in Emma's expression too. Something that looked almost like confirmation. Like maybe Katie Martinez had been right all along. Maybe old equipment did mean you were falling behind. Sarah saw it and felt something crack inside her chest. I'm going to ask around, she said, standing up. Someone knows something. But the doubt was already there, a small voice whispering in the back of her mind. Maybe you should have bought new years ago. Maybe you were wrong to hold on so tight. Maybe your father was wrong too. She pushed the thought away, but it didn't go far. Saturday morning at the farmer's co-op, the place smelled like seed corn and diesel fuel, and the coffee they kept brewing in the back corner. Farmers gathered here the way mechanics gathered in garages to talk about problems, trade solutions, share information the companies didn't advertise. Gary Young stood by the seed display filling out an order form. 67 years old, farming the land adjacent to Sarah's place. He looked up when she approached. Heard your 402's down. News traveled fast in small communities. Sarah nodded. Injector nozzle. Went to Greenfield dealership yesterday. They say the part's discontinued. Gary's expression didn't show surprise. It showed something worse, recognition. A1621R. Sarah stopped. How'd you know the part number? Because David Mitchell got told the same thing 3 weeks ago. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. What was David's part? Hydraulic valve, different tractor, different part. Same story. Dealership said it was obsolete, unavailable, discontinued. Gary signed his order form, pushed him hard toward new equipment. Did he buy? Gary's face darkened. $142,000 combined. He's 2 payments behind already. Bank called him last week. He paused. He might lose the farm. Sarah's stomach tightened. David Mitchell had been farming longer than she had. Good land, good farmer. And now facing foreclosure over a part that probably cost $60. There's more, Gary continued. Andrew Jackson, you know him, farms about 15 miles east. He got told the same thing last month. Transmission sensor, they said it was no longer available. His voice dropped lower. 3 farmers, 3 different parts, 3 different tractors. Same answer from the dealership. You noticed something. Sarah thought about the 6M tractor in the showroom. The practiced way Jason had pivoted from part doesn't exist to you should upgrade. All of them got pushed toward new equipment, she said slowly. New loans, new payments. You need to talk to someone who knows how these companies really work. Who? Gary pulled a business card from his wallet, wrote a phone number on the back. My brother-in-law worked for John Deere for 38 years. He paused. But I should warn you, Kenneth's brilliant, but he got a little paranoid after what happened. What happened? John Deere fired him in 2010. He tried to push back on some policy changes. They made an example of him. Gary handed her the card. If anyone knows whether that part really disappeared, it's him. 3 days later, a faded blue Ford pickup pulled into Sarah's driveway. Rust spots lined the wheel wells. Toolboxes rattled in the bed. The man who climbed out moved with the deliberate pace of someone who'd spent 7 decades learning not to rush. Kenneth Lee was 74 years old. The cap on his head bore grease stains that looked permanent. His hands showed the wear of a lifetime around machinery, scarred knuckles, calluses, in specific places where tools had pressed against skin 10,000 times. He didn't introduce himself with stories or credentials. He simply walked over to the 4020 and looked at it the way a doctor studies a patient. Sarah watched him from the porch. There was something about the way he moved, careful, methodical, but also slightly paranoid. His eyes kept darting to the road to the tree line like he expected someone to be watching. Kenneth's fingers traced the injector housing. He listened while Sarah explained the problem. Rough idle, black smoke, cold start stumble. Kenneth nodded once. Injector nozzle. Sarah blinked. That's what I thought. Part number A, B1621R. He said it without looking at any manual, without checking any reference. Just pulled it from memory like it was written on his bones. Then Kenneth froze for just a moment. His expression changed, not surprise, but something darker. Recognition. Like a puzzle piece clicking into place in a pattern he'd seen before. Mind showing me the paperwork from the dealership? Sarah handed him the slip Jason had given her on her. Kenneth read it slowly, carefully, like a lawyer examining a contract. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. The pages were yellowed, filled with handwritten notes in cramped script, factory codes, casting numbers, engineering references, decades of knowledge recorded in ink that had faded but never disappeared. Kenneth flipped through the pages, not frantically, but with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. His fingers stopped on a line of numbers. He tapped the page twice. That nozzle never stopped being made. Sarah stared at him, trying to process what that meant. What do you mean? Kenneth closed the notebook with care. When he looked at her, his eyes held something that might have been anger or might have been vindication, maybe both. They just stopped selling it to farmers. The words settled over the moment like a judgment. How can they do that? Kenneth slipped the notebook back into his pocket. Simple. They changed the catalog. He explained it the way a teacher explains a fundamental truth to a student who's finally ready to understand. Big manufacturers use the same components across multiple product lines. Agricultural equipment, construction equipment, industrial engines, generators. The same casting, the same part appears in all of them, just under different catalog numbers. AB1621R is what they called it for agricultural use. But that same part, same casting, same specifications, it's sold under a different number in their industrial division. Sarah felt the anger building again, but this time it was colder, more focused. So the part exists. The part exists. It's in their warehouse right now, probably a dozen of them sitting on a shelf. But when that sales rep looks it up in the agricultural database, the system tells him it's discontinued because they programmed it that way. Why would they do that? Kenneth looked toward the horizon, his eyes distant. Because that tractor of yours is worth more to them broken than running. The sentence hung in the air like an accusation. Your 4020 doesn't generate any revenue for them, Kenneth continued. You paid for it once back in 1995. Since then, nothing. No monthly payments, no service contracts, no dealer maintenance. He paused. But if they can convince you the tractor is unfixable, that parts don't exist, that your only option is to upgrade, then suddenly you're paying them $740 a month for 7 years. That's $62,000 in interest alone, plus service contracts, plus dealer maintenance that's required to keep the warranty valid. Sarah's hands clenched. That's not right. No, Kenneth said quietly. But it works. His voice dropped even lower. And I know it works because I was there when they designed the policy. 2009, right before the financial crisis ended. I was still on the engineering review board. Marketing came in with this whole presentation about optimizing parts lifecycle management. That's what they called it. Made it sound like efficiency, like streamlining operations. He pulled out the notebook again, flipped to a different page. But I read the actual implementation plan, saw the projected revenue increase from equipment financing, saw the target numbers for conversion rates, how many farmers they expected to push from repair to replacement. He looked at Sarah. I objected, told them it was predatory, told them it would destroy farmers who couldn't afford debt. They thanked me for my input and fired me 6 months later. Called it restructuring, but everyone knew. Sarah understood now why Gary had called him paranoid. When you'd been punished for telling the truth, vigilance wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Kenneth walked over to his pickup and grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox. They spent the next 30 minutes inspecting the injector system. Kenneth worked with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, checking the injector body, the pump timing the fuel lines. Finally, he stood up and wiped his hands. You were right. Just the nozzle. Should cost about $50. Sarah crossed her arms. Which they won't sell me. Kenneth studied her for a moment, measuring something she couldn't quite read. What do you want to do about it? I don't know. They have the computers. They have the system. I'm just one farmer. Kenneth's expression shifted. The paranoia she'd seen earlier was still there, but underneath it was something else, determination mixed with old anger. Or maybe the resolve of someone who'd stayed quiet too long and had finally decided to speak. Systems are run by people, he said, and people make mistakes when they think nobody is watching. He pulled the notebook out again, opened it to a page filled with cross-references. They said no because you asked the wrong way. This time we'll ask different questions. Sarah looked at the notebook, at decades of knowledge someone had tried to make disappear. You really think we can make them sell it? Kenneth's smile was thin, hard. I think they're going to wish they had. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table long after Mark and Emma had gone to bed. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. She thought about the tractor sitting in the shed, 53 years old, 10,000 mornings, never once refused to work until the day a 50-cent piece of metal wore through. She thought about David Mitchell, 2 payments behind on a combine he didn't need, facing foreclosure because a dealership had lied about a $60 part. She thought about her father, about the auction, about the 5 years of watching him fade, about the letters she'd never opened. And she thought about Kenneth's notebook, those yellowed pages filled with truth that contradicted the computer screens and the polished showrooms and the sales pitches designed to push people into debt. The fear was there, real fear. The kind that came from understanding how much power a multi-billion-dollar corporation had compared to one farmer with an old tractor. But underneath the fear was something else. Her father had believed the company always won. He believed it so completely that when they took his farm, he'd seen no other option. Sarah pulled open the desk drawer. The letter was still there, sealed in a manila envelope, her father's name written in the county clerk's handwriting. Her hand hovered over it. 30 years she'd avoided this moment. She picked it up, broke the seal, unfolded the single page inside. Her father's handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. I'm sorry, I wasn't strong enough. I thought if I worked harder, if I did everything right, it would be enough. But they make the rules, and the rules are designed so we can't win. I don't blame anyone for being born into a system that grinds people like us into dust. I just couldn't keep fighting, knowing it would never matter. Don't let them do this to you. Don't let them win like they won against me. I love you. I'm sorry. Sarah folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope. When Mark came down an hour later, he found her still sitting there, eyes dry, jaw set. You okay? Kenneth's coming back tomorrow, she said. We're going to make them sell us that part. And if they refuse, Sarah looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Not anger exactly, but the kind of calm determination that came from making a decision you knew would cost you. Then we make it very clear that refusing to sell a part that exists while pushing someone toward unnecessary debt is the kind of thing reporters find interesting. Mark pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. This could get ugly. Probably will. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "We just got out of debt," he said quietly. "But I'd rather go back into it fighting than stay free by accepting their lie." Sarah squeezed his hand. Outside, the February night was cold and clear. The tractor sat in the shed waiting. And in the drawer, her father's letter lay folded, not a suicide note anymore, but a challenge. "Don't let them win like they won against me." Tomorrow, Sarah decided they wouldn't. Kenneth arrived at 7:30 the next morning with a cardboard file box. He set it on the hood of his pickup and started pulling out documents, photocopies of factory specifications, cross-reference charts showing how parts map between divisions, printouts from websites Sarah had never heard of. "This," Kenneth said, holding up a cross-reference sheet, "is the smoking gun, a B1621R agricultural designation, IE-472B industrial designation, same casting number C-4721-W, same Waterloo manufacturing reference, same specifications down to the micron." Mark came out of the house with coffee. Emma followed, backpack slung over her shoulder, then stopped when she saw the papers. "What's all this?" "Evidence," Kenneth said. He pulled out another document. This one looked official, stamped with federal seals. "Right to repair guidance issued in 2024, Section AG-07, makes it illegal for manufacturers to restrict access to repair parts under false emissions. Compliance claims for equipment manufactured before 2010. He tapped the paper. That 4020 was built in 1972. Sarah studied the documents, trying to absorb the technical details. "They'll just say this doesn't apply. Corporate policy, inventory management, something. Let them." Kenneth added a final piece to the stack, a screenshot from that morning showing the John Deere Industrial Parts website. Part number IE-472B injection nozzle assembly. In stock. Available for immediate order. $47. "The part's been there all along," Kenneth said. "They just didn't want you to find it." Emma leaned closer, reading the screen. Her young mind was trying to piece together what was happening. Why adults would lie about something so simple. Why a company would hide parts from the people who needed them. "Are we going back to the dealership?" Sarah nodded. "Tomorrow morning." "It's a school day. This is more important." Sarah looked at her daughter, seeing the embarrassment that had been there for weeks, the shame about old equipment, the feeling of falling behind. Sometimes you learn more watching your mother stand up to a system designed to push people into debt than you do in algebra class. Emma's expression shifted. Not quite pride yet, but the beginning of something. "Can I come?" "Yes." They pulled into the Greenfield dealership parking lot at 8:50. 4 of them this time: Sarah, Kenneth, Mark, Emma. 3 vehicles in a line like a small convoy. The showroom was warmer than the morning outside, but the light felt artificial. The 6M tractor still occupied center position, price tag still hanging from the roll bar like an accusation. Jason Cole looked up from the parts counter. His expression went through several rapid changes when he saw them, neutral to recognizing Sarah, to something that might have been concern when he saw Kenneth beside her. "Morning? Morning?" Sarah set the paper with the part number on the counter between them. "Need an AB1621R injector nozzle for a 4020. Jason's fingers moved to the keyboard reflexively like muscle memory. He typed the number, waited for the screen to refresh. "That part's still discontinued, like I told you last week." Kenneth stepped forward, his movement deliberate enough that Jason's attention shifted. "Show me the system." Jason blinked. "It's company property, not for customer access." "Then access the all-region inventory override." The words landed like a physical impact. Jason's face went blank for exactly 2 seconds, processing what he'd just heard. Those weren't terms ordinary customers used. Those were internal commands, the kind that existed in training manuals and back-end databases, but never in conversations with farmers. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kenneth pulled the notebook from his jacket and opened it to a marked page. Set it on the counter where Jason could see decades of handwritten factory codes and reference numbers. "AllReg, that's the command every service manager has access to. It shows cross-division inventory instead of just agricultural database entries." Jason stared at the notebook like it was something that shouldn't exist. Before he could formulate a response, a door behind the counter opened and Stephen Taylor emerged. The service manager was 39, pressed white shirt, the kind of corporate polish that came from regional training seminars where they taught you how to say no without sounding like you were saying no. His eyes moved across all four of them, measuring the situation with practiced efficiency. "What's going on out here?" Jason turned, relief visible. "These people are asking about a discontinued part." Stephen stepped to the counter, his posture assertive but not aggressive. "Which part?" "A, B, 162, 1R injector nozzle for a John Deere 4020. Stephen's fingers moved to the keyboard without hesitation. He typed the number, glanced at the screen, and his expression remained professionally neutral. "That part's been discontinued for several years." Kenneth reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded cross-reference sheet, unfolded it with the care of someone handling evidence, laid it on the counter. The chart showed part numbers mapped between divisions. A B1621R agricultural designation, IE-472B industrial designation, same casting number, same Waterloo manufacturing reference, same specifications. Stephen looked at the document, and something flickered across his face: recognition, then something else. The realization that whoever he was dealing with wasn't just another farmer asking questions. "Where did you get this?" Kenneth's voice stayed level, factual. "I helped design the injector tooling in 1974. Waterloo Works, 38 years on that factory floor." Stephen picked up the cross-reference sheet, studying it more carefully now. When he looked up, his professional demeanor had cracked slightly. "Even if this is accurate, we can't sell across divisions without corporate authorization." Kenneth pulled out his phone, scrolled to a bookmarked page, held it up so Stephen could read the screen. "Federal Right to Repair Guidance, Section AG-07. The text was clear enough to read from 3 feet away. "Manufacturers may not restrict access to repair parts under emissions compliance claims for equipment manufactured before 2010. That 4020 was built in 1972. Stephen's jaw tightened. He set down the cross-reference sheet. "This isn't about emissions compliance. It's about proper inventory allocation across product divisions." "Then what's it about?" The question hung there. Stephen's eyes moved from Kenneth to Sarah to the documentation spread across the counter. His hand reached for the phone at his belt, then hesitated. When he spoke, his voice had changed, not defensive anymore, but something closer to resignation. "I'll need to consult with regional management before I can authorize any cross-division parts requests." "How long will that take?" "Could be several days." Kenneth's expression didn't change, but his voice took on an edge. "We'll wait." Stephen's professionalism reasserted itself. "Company policy doesn't permit customers to wait in the showroom for management decisions. If you'd like to leave a contact number, we'll wait in the parking lot then." The two men locked eyes. Stephen's hand moved to the phone again. "I can't have people loitering on dealership property." Sarah spoke for the first time since the exchange began, her voice quiet but carrying something that made both men look at her. "Then sell us the part that's sitting in your warehouse." Stephen's finger hovered over the phone. The showroom had gone silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Jason stood frozen behind the counter. Emma watched from near the entrance, her 15-year-old mind recording every detail. Stephen looked at Sarah for a long moment, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding maybe, or just the recognition that they were both trapped in roles neither of them had chosen. "I have 3 kids," Stephen said quietly. 2 in college, 1 starting next year. I do this job because it pays for that." He paused. "I know the part exists. I know it's in the warehouse. But if I sell it to you without authorization, I lose this job." Sarah held his gaze. "And if you don't sell it, I lose my farm, just like my father did." The words hung in the air. Stephen's expression shifted, not to sympathy exactly, but to something more complex. The look of a man who'd been telling himself for years that he was just following orders, just doing his job, and had suddenly been confronted with the cost of those choices. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Kenneth gathered the documents from the counter with careful precision. He looked at Stephen with the calm of someone who'd already calculated the next 3 moves. "We'll leave. But we're not done. Outside, the February sun felt colder than it had going in. Sarah's hands shook as she unlocked the truck, adrenaline and frustration mixing in her bloodstream. That didn't work. Kenneth climbed into his Ford, his face showing no emotion. It worked exactly like I expected. Now we know they're aware the part exists. They're just choosing not to sell it. Emma got in Mark's sedan, her voice tight with confusion and anger. Why would they do that? It doesn't make sense. Mark started the engine, letting it warm. Because if they sell the part, they lose the sale. And the sale is worth a lot more than $47. That afternoon, Emma sat in the cafeteria at Riverside High School, her lunch tray untouched. Katie Martinez dropped into the seat across from her, all confidence and casual dismissal. Katie's father owned 3 car dealerships in the county. The Martinez family had money in a way that made them careless about it. Heard your tractor's still broken. Emma's jaw tightened. We're getting it fixed. My dad says if people can't afford to maintain equipment, they shouldn't be farming. The words hit harder than they should have. Emma felt heat rising in her face, shame mixing with anger, in a way that made her hands clench under the table. We can maintain it fine. The dealership just won't sell us the part. Katie laughed, the sound carrying across the cafeteria. Won't sell you the part? That's a new excuse. Maybe they know your credit's no good. Emma stood up fast enough to knock her chair backward. The cafeteria went quiet. Katie's smile faltered. My family paid off our farm. Your family still owes the bank for 3 dealerships. So maybe worry about your own credit. She walked out before Katie could respond, before the shame could swallow her whole. But the feeling stayed, the sense that somehow having a broken tractor and being unable to fix it made her less. That evening, Mark sat alone at the computer in the small office off the kitchen. The question had been gnawing at him since the confrontation that morning, the sense that what Sarah was facing couldn't possibly be isolated to one dealership in one Iowa town. He typed into Google John Deere right to repair. The screen filled with results, articles from the last 3 years, lawsuits in multiple states, farmers organizing, journalists investigating. The phrase appeared over and over: planned obsolescence, corporate control, repair restrictions. He clicked through to the Des Moines Register and found a series of articles by Rachel Stone, agricultural reporter, 52 years old according to her bio. Someone who'd been covering farming issues for 2 decades. The most recent piece, published 6 weeks ago, carried the headline, Digital Locks on Tractors, Who Really Owns the Equipment Farmers Buy? Mark read the entire article, his anger building with each paragraph. Diagnostic software that required dealer access, error codes that couldn't be read without proprietary tools, service manuals that were no longer published. And underneath it all, the same pattern: they'd encountered parts that existed but were made unavailable through catalog manipulation and inventory segregation. He clicked the contact link and composed an email. Kept it factual. Dealership refusing to sell part. Part exists under different catalog number. Farmer pushed toward unnecessary debt. Multiple cases in same county following identical pattern. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came the next morning. This is exactly the pattern I have been investigating. Can I interview your wife? I'd like to document the specific case and the technical details. Would Thursday work? Mark found Sarah in the shop cleaning tools she'd already cleaned twice. I contacted a reporter at the Des Moines Register. She wants to interview you Thursday. Sarah set down the wrench she'd been wiping. Why would you do that? Because this isn't just about us. David Mitchell is facing foreclosure. How many others are there? How many farmers got lied to and believed it because the computer said discontinued? I don't want to be in the newspaper. This is between us and the dealership. Mark crossed his branches. It stopped when being just between you and them when they made it company policy. When they programmed their system to hide parts. When they trained their sales staff to push debt instead of selling repair components. Sarah's shoulders sagged. She knew he was right, even if the idea of going public felt like exposing something private. What if it makes things worse? Worse than being forced into $250,000 of debt? Worse than watching David lose his farm? Worse than teaching Emma that systems can't be challenged? Sarah looked at her hands. 50 years old, worked these fields since she was younger than Emma, paid off the mortgage 2 years ago, finally free. And now this. Okay, Thursday. Friday afternoon, Stephen Taylor sat in his office at the dealership, phone pressed to his ear. Except it wasn't Stephen calling, it was someone calling him. The voice on the other end was professional, measured. A lawyer, Richard Foster from John Deere's corporate legal team. Mr. Taylor, we've been informed that a customer has been making inquiries about cross-division parts availability. Is this accurate? Stephen's hand tightened on the phone. Yes, sir. A farmer came in requesting an agricultural part that shows as discontinued in our system. She had documentation showing it exists under an industrial designation. I see. And what was your response? I told her I'd need to consult with regional management before authorizing the sale. That's correct procedure. Foster paused. However, I need to make you aware of a developing situation. The customer in question has contacted media. A reporter from the Des Moines Register has scheduled an interview. Stephen felt his stomach drop. We need to make something very clear, Mr. Taylor. If this customer makes public claims about company policy claims that could be construed as alleging intentional deception or fraudulent business practices, that crosses into defamation territory. Corporate legal will treat such allegations very seriously. I understand. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it appears this situation has escalated beyond a simple parts request. An escalation has consequences. Stephen didn't answer. I want you to call the customer, Foster continued. Make her aware that making false or misleading statements about company policy could have legal ramifications. Farm foreclosures happen, Mr. Taylor. Legal disputes are expensive. It would be unfortunate if this farmer lost everything over a newspaper article. The line went dead. Stephen sat there for a long moment staring at the phone. He had 3 kids, 2 in college, 1 starting next year. He needed this job. But he also had known from the moment Kenneth Lee laid that cross-reference chart on the counter that what the company was doing wasn't right. He picked up his personal cell phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the 3rd ring. This is Sarah. Sarah Williams, this is Stephen Taylor from Greenfield John Deere. I understand you've been speaking with the press. I told a reporter what happened, that you wouldn't sell me a part that exists. Stephen chose his next words carefully, aware that corporate might be listening, might be recording. Mrs. Williams, I need to make you aware that making public claims about company policy claims that could be considered defamatory could have legal consequences. Corporate has attorneys on retainer. They handle situations like this regularly. There was silence on the other end. Then Sarah's voice came back, and it had changed, gone flat and hard. Are you threatening me? I'm making you aware of potential consequences. More silence. Then, Mr. Taylor, let me make something very clear. I'm not claiming anything false. I'm stating facts. You refuse to sell me AB 1621R. That's true. The part exists as IE-472B in your industrial catalog. That's true. If you're worried about how those facts sound when spoken out loud, maybe the problem isn't me talking. She hung up. Stephen set down the phone and put his head in his hands. He thought about his kids, about the mortgage, about the years he'd spent convincing himself that he was just doing his job, just following policy, that it wasn't his responsibility to question the system. And he thought about Sarah Williams, who reminded him uncomfortably of his own mother, a woman who'd worked 2 jobs to keep their farm running after his father died, who taught him that independence meant not owing anyone. He pulled up his email and started typing. Not to corporate, to an address he'd kept for years, but never thought he'd use. The subject line was simple. You were right. The body of the email was even simpler. I should have listened. I'm sorry. I'm ready to help if you'll still have me. He sent it to Kenneth Lee. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a USB drive. Started copying files, email chains, corporate memos, training materials that explicitly instructed salespeople to push financing instead of selling parts. Everything he'd been pretending not to see for 5 years. If he was going to lose his job, and he was pretty sure he was going to lose his job, he might as well make it count. The next morning, Saturday, the Farmers Co-op transformed into something between a union hall and a war room. Word had spread through the rural community the way information always spread: phone calls, conversations at the grain elevator, mentions at church. By 10 o'clock 11, farmers had gathered in the back room where the co-op usually held seed company presentations. Gary Young stood at the front with a legal pad covered in names and part numbers and dealership stories that all followed the same pattern. Sarah told her story first. A B1621R, discontinued, pushed toward financing. Then David Mitchell stood, hydraulic valve, same script, $142,000 in debt, foreclosure looming. Andrew Jackson came next, 28 years old, third-generation farmer, trying to keep his grandfather's operation viable. Transmission sensor RE28491 told me it hadn't been manufactured in a decade. Tractor sat idle for 3 weeks during spring planting while they tried to sell me a $110,000 replacement. George White, fuel pump housing, no longer available, suggested leasing instead of owning. Ronald Sanchez, PTO shaft, obsolete parts for obsolete equipment. Mary Sanders stepped forward, one of only 3 women in the room besides Sarah. 43 years old, farming alone since her husband died in a grain elevator accident 5 years ago. Starter solenoid, she said. Jason Cole looked at me like I didn't know what I was talking about. Explained very slowly that maybe farming was too complicated for someone in my situation. Then spent 20 minutes trying to sell me equipment I didn't need and couldn't afford. The pattern was undeniable. Part fails, part discontinued, financing pressure, and in every case, the farmer either went into debt or the equipment sat broken. Kenneth stood at the back, notebook open. As each farmer told their story, he wrote down the part numbers. Then he spent 15 minutes looking them up in cross-reference charts and industrial catalogs he accessed on his phone. Every single part existed, different catalog numbers, different division codes, but existing, in stock, available. They're doing this systematically, Kenneth said, his voice cutting through the rising anger in the room. This isn't individual salesmen making mistakes. This is corporate policy executed at the dealership level. Sarah had been standing near the door listening. Now she spoke up. The reporter from Des Moines Register is interviewing me Thursday. She's investigating parts access restrictions. This is exactly what she needs to hear. Gary looked around the room at the assembled farmers. How many of you would be willing to talk to a reporter? Go on record. Hands went up. 8 of the 11. The ones who didn't were the ones still making payments, still dependent on dealership service, still trapped in the system enough that speaking out felt too dangerous. Then we organize, Gary said, his voice taking on the authority of someone who'd served in the County Farm Bureau for 15 years. Document everything, part numbers, dates, what they told us, what they tried to sell instead. We make a case they can't ignore. The meeting continued for another hour. Plans forming, a shared spreadsheet to track parts requests and refusals, coordination for a group visit to the dealership Monday morning, contact information exchanged. The beginning of something that felt bigger than any individual repair problem. Emma had come with Sarah and now sat in the corner watching farmers who'd spent their lives working independently come together around a common problem. Men and women who'd built their identities on self-reliance, learning that some fights required collective action. Near the end of the meeting, Tom Bradford stood up. Tom was 45, ran a large operation 3 counties over. More acreage than most of the people in the room combined. He'd been quiet through most of the discussion. I think you're all making a mistake, he said. The room went silent. These dealerships, we need them. Not just for parts, but for fertilizer, chemical, seed. If we go public with this, if we make enemies of them, where does that leave us? He looked around the room. I've got relationships with Greenfield that go back 20 years. I'm not going to burn that over a pissing match about part numbers. He grabbed his coat and walked out. The silence after he left felt heavy. He's scared, Kenneth said quietly, and he should be. But fear is how they keep control. Sarah looked at the remaining farmers, the ones who'd stayed, who'd raised their hands, who'd decided that fighting was worth the risk. Monday morning, and she said, we all go back to the dealership. Together, we ask for our parts, And when they refuse, we make sure everyone's watching. That same afternoon, Kenneth's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized when he hadn't seen in 15 years. Kenneth Lee. Mr. Lee, this is Stephen Taylor from Greenfield John Deere. Kenneth's jaw tightened. I know who you are. I got your email, the one you sent in 2010, after they fired you. Silence on Kenneth's end. I was the assistant service manager back then, Stephen continued, 24 years old, fresh out of their management training program. I watched what they did to you, how they manufactured that restructuring excuse, how they blacklisted you from the industry. He paused. I told myself you were overreacting, that the policy made sense from a business perspective, that you just didn't understand modern operations. Why are you calling me? Because you were right, and I spent 15 years pretending you weren't. Stephen's voice dropped. I just got off the phone with corporate legal. They want me to threaten Sarah Williams, make her scared enough to drop the story, and I did it. I called her and delivered their script like a good little employee. Kenneth said nothing. But then I sat in my office and thought about my kids, about what I'm teaching them, about whether I want them to grow up thinking this is how the world has to work. He took a breath. I have files, internal emails, training documents, policy memos dating back to when they first implemented the catalog segregation. Evidence that this wasn't accidental, it was designed. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm ready to help, if you'll still have me. Kenneth looked out the window of his workshop at the fading afternoon light. 15 years he'd waited for this. 15 years of being dismissed as a bitter ex-employee with an axe to grind. You understand what this means. For your job, your career. I have 3 kids to feed, but I also have to look at myself in the mirror. Stephen paused. My mother was a farmer, single mother after my dad died. She would have been one of the people they pushed into debt. She's gone now, but if she were alive, she'd be ashamed of what I've become. Kenneth made a decision. Monday morning, Greenfield dealership, 9 o'clock. Bring everything you have. Sunday evening, Kenneth's truck appeared in Sarah's driveway again. But this time he wasn't alone. Stephen Taylor climbed out of the passenger seat looking uncomfortable in jeans and a sweatshirt instead of his usual pressed work clothes. Sarah met them on the porch, her expression wary. This is unexpected. Stephen has something for you, Kenneth said. Stephen held up a USB drive. Internal corporate communications, policy documentation, training materials. Everything that proves the parts restriction was intentional, not accidental. He handed it to Sarah. And I'll testify, to reporters, to lawyers, to whoever needs to hear it. Sarah took the drive, studying Stephen's face. Why? Because I have 3 kids, and I want them to grow up in a world where doing the right thing still matters. He paused. And because someone needs to start telling the truth. Mark came out of the house. Emma followed. They stood on the porch while Stephen explained what the files contained: emails from marketing departments discussing conversion optimization strategies, training documents that explicitly instructed sales staff to push financing over parts, sales internal projections, showing expected revenue increases from equipment replacement. This changes everything, Mark said quietly. Kenneth nodded. Tomorrow morning isn't just about getting one part anymore. It's about proving the system is rigged. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her father, about the auction, about the years she'd spent believing the story he'd believed, that corporations always won, that fighting back was futile. But now she had evidence. She had witnesses. She had 11 other farmers who'd been lied to the same way. And she had a man who'd worked inside the system, who'd seen how it operated, who'd finally decided his conscience mattered more than his career. Around midnight, she went to the desk drawer and pulled out her father's letter one more time. Don't let them win like they won against me. I won't, Dad, she whispered. This time we've got them. Monday morning arrived with fog thick enough to obscure the county road. Sarah drove through it at 6:30, finishing chores early so she'd have time to shower and change into clean clothes. This wasn't just another trip to the dealership. This was testimony. Evidence, a confrontation that would either force change or prove how little power ordinary people held against corporate systems. By 8:45, the Greenfield dealership parking lot held more vehicles than it typically saw in a week. Pickup trucks arranged in loose formation, farmers climbing out, most of them older than 50, a few younger ones who'd inherited operations and debt simultaneously. 12 in total, some brought their wives. David brought his adult daughter who worked as a paralegal in Des Moines and understood documentation requirements. Rachel Stone arrived at 8:50 in a sedan that marked her as someone who didn't work land for a living. She stepped out with a camera bag and a digital recorder, her eyes taking in the assembled group with the practiced assessment of someone who'd covered farm bankruptcies and foreclosures and commodity crashes for 20 years. Sarah Williams. Sarah raised her hand. Rachel walked over, extending hers for a shake that was firm and professional. Your husband said there'd be others. 12 farmers, all told the same thing about different parts. Rachel's eyes lit up the way reporters' eyes do when a story that seemed isolated turns systemic. I'm going to record everything. Video if they'll allow it inside. You okay with that? That's why you're here. Kenneth stood near his truck, reviewing his notebook one final time. The pages had become a kind of scripture over the past week, containing truth that contradicted official systems knowledge that exposed carefully constructed lies. Emma stayed close to her mother, wearing clothes too nice for a school day. Mark had insisted, despite her protest, that missing algebra wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a 15-year-old's education. Stephen Taylor pulled up in his personal car, not the dealership vehicle he usually drove. He looked pale but determined. At 9 o'clock, they walked in together. The showroom fell silent when 12 farmers entered in a group. Jason Cole wasn't behind the parts counter. A younger employee Sarah didn't recognize stood there instead, looking confused and slightly panicked. Stephen Taylor emerged from the back, but not through his office door. He came through the main entrance with the farmers standing with them instead of behind the counter. A different manager appeared from the office, someone Sarah had never seen before. Mid-50s corporate suit instead of Stephen's usual polo shirt. His name tag read Robert Kensington, Regional Manager. I'm not sure what you think you're accomplishing here. Kenneth's voice carried across the showroom. We're requesting parts, standard transaction, nothing complicated. Kensington's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were calculating. Mr. Taylor is no longer authorized to conduct business on behalf of this dealership. He's been suspended pending an internal investigation. Stephen stepped forward. I resigned Saturday evening, effective immediately. He pulled a folder from under his arm, and I brought documentation that I think these people and this reporter will find very interesting. Kensington's professional mask cracked slightly. Whatever personal grievances you have with company policy, Mr. Taylor, should be addressed through proper channels, not through public displays. I tried proper channels for 15 years. They don't work. Stephen set the folder on a display case. So now we're trying transparency. Sarah stepped up forward. Abe 1621R, injector nozzle for a John Deere 4020. The young employee at the counter looked at Kensington, uncertain what to do. Type it in, Kensington said. The screen refreshed. Shows discontinued. David Mitchell moved up next. Hydraulic valve AR3847 for a John Deere 4440. Same typing, same screen. Discontinued. Andrew Jackson. Transmission sensor RE28491 for a John Deere 4230. Discontinued. One by one, each farmer stepped forward. Part number. Tractor model. And each time the same answer. The pattern became ritualistic, damning in its repetition. Rachel's camera recorded everything. Even the mechanics in the service bay had stopped working, drawn by the unusual tension. Kenneth let them finish before he spoke. When he did, his voice held the authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades inside the system they were challenging. Access the all-region inventory override. Kensington's face hardened. That function is restricted to authorized personnel for approved business purposes. All red command, type it. The showroom had gone completely silent. I'm not authorized to, Stephen interrupted. I was authorized for 15 years. He moved behind the counter, gently nudging the young employee aside. Let me show you how it works. Kensington moved to stop him, but Rachel's camera swung in his direction and he froze. Stephen's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced, familiarity. He typed a command, paused, typed again. The screen refreshed. A B1621R, he said, then typed the part number. Even from across the showroom, everyone could see the change in the display. Red text turning to green, discontinued becoming available. 4 units in stock, industrial division, warehouse location B7, bin 43. Stephen looked at Kensington. Would you like me to check the others? That's when Tom Bradford did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone, opened Facebook, and started a live stream. This is Tom Bradford farming 3 counties over, he said into the camera. I'm at Greenfield John Deere with 11 other farmers. We were all told parts don't exist. We're about to find out if that's true. He turned the phone toward the counter, toward Stephen at the keyboard, toward Kensington's pale face. Within 2 minutes, 500 people were watching. Within 5 minutes, 2,000. The viewer count climbed in real time, visible on Tom's screen. Kensington saw it. His face went from pale to flushed. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number with shaking hands. Stephen kept working. One by one, he entered the part numbers. One by one, the screen showed what Kenneth's documentation had already proven. Every discontinued part existed. Every obsolete component was actually in inventory. Every unavailable item sat in the warehouse, accessible through the right database commands but hidden from farmers by design. Hydraulic valve 7 units, warehouse B7, bin 51. Transmission sensor 12 units, warehouse C3, bin 22. Fuel pump housing 3 units, warehouse B7, bin 43. Pitot shaft 6 units, warehouse A2, bin 18. Down the list, every part requested that morning showing available stock, warehouse location, bin number. David Mitchell's voice broke. All this time, it was here, 30 feet from where you told me it didn't exist. Kensington was still on the phone, his voice low and urgent. He hung up and looked at the assembled group. Corporate is reviewing the situation. I'm authorized to offer a one-time exception to standard inventory allocation procedures. We can special order these parts through industrial channels. Delivery in 6 to 8 weeks. That's not good enough, Sarah said. The parts are in the warehouse right now. We can see them on the screen. Sell them to us. Kensington's professional mask was crumbling. I don't have authorization. You don't need authorization, Stephen said. You need courage. He pulled the USB drive from his pocket, set it on the counter. Or I can give this to the reporter right now. Email chains from 2018 where marketing explicitly discusses hiding parts to drive equipment sales. Training documents that instruct staff to push financing. Revenue projections based on forcing farmers into debt. Kensington stared at the drive like it was a bomb. His phone rang again. He answered, listened, his face going through several expressions. When he hung up, something had changed in his posture. Corporate is authorizing the sale, standard retail pricing, all requested parts. The words came out like an admission of defeat. Kenneth pulled out his notepad, defined standard retail pricing. Kensington pulled up a screen. A B1621 auger $47. Hydraulic valve $62. Transmission sensor $38. Prices that made the financing they'd been pushed toward look obscene in comparison. Prices that revealed the entire system for what it was, a mechanism designed to extract wealth from people who just wanted to fix what they owned. Process the transactions. It took 40 minutes to complete all the paperwork. 12 separate sales. Part numbers entered, inventory depleted, credit cards run, receipts printed. Each farmer receiving a physical part or a pickup slip for larger components. Physical proof that what they'd been told didn't exist had actually been sitting in a warehouse 30 feet from where they'd first been denied. Sarah held a small cardboard box containing AB1621R like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. $47. 2 years of mortgage payments avoided. $250,000 in debt prevented. All because of a part the size of her thumb that corporate had decided farmers weren't allowed to access. David held his receipt for the hydraulic valve with hands that shook. $62 versus the $142,000 he'd borrowed, versus the farm he was about to lose. I need to call my attorney, he said to no one in particular. We're filing against the dealership today. Kensington overheard. His face went even paler. As the farmers filed out, Stephen gathered his folder in the USB drive. Sarah stopped him. "What will you do now?" "I don't know, but at least I'll sleep at night." He paused. "My mother was a farmer. She died 5 years ago. I kept telling myself she'd understand why I did this job, why I followed the policies. But I know she wouldn't have. She'd have been ashamed. She'd be proud of what you did today." Stephen managed a tired smile. "Maybe, I hope so." Kenneth approached them. "I've been thinking. We're going to need someone who understands the dealer network. Someone who knows how the system operates from the inside. The coalition that's forming it could use that expertise." Stephen looked at him. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a purpose. Pays terrible. Hours are worse, but the work matters." Stephen didn't hesitate. "When do I start?" Tom's Facebook live stream ended at 47,000 viewers. By noon, clips from it had been shared across agricultural forums, right to repair groups, and general news outlets. By evening, it had reached 2 million views. The comments section was a torrent. Farmers from 20 states sharing similar experiences, mechanics describing diagnostic lockouts, rural communities discussing how dealership consolidation had eliminated competition and choice. The pattern wasn't isolated to Iowa. It was nationwide, systematic, institutionalized, and now it was documented. Rachel Stone's article posted Tuesday morning. The headline read, "Farmers Force John Deere Dealer to Reveal Hidden Parts Inventory." But it was the subheading that made the story go viral. Former manager provides internal documents showing systematic deception. The article laid out everything. The systematic refusals, the cross-reference parts existing under different catalog numbers, the override command that revealed inventory dealerships claimed didn't exist. The financing pushed on farmers who only needed repair components. David Mitchell's near foreclosure. Sarah's avoided debt. Kenneth's technical documentation proving every claim. And Stephen Taylor's USB drive containing years of internal corporate communications that proved none of it was accidental. The story included scanned documents redacted to protect individual employee names, but clear enough to show the corporate strategy. One email from a regional marketing director in 2018 was particularly damning. Parts sales generate single transaction revenue. Equipment financing generates recurring revenue streams over 5 to 7 year periods. Our goal is to shift farmer behavior from repair to replacement. Catalog segregation and inventory restrictions are key tools in achieving this objective. Comments poured in. Thousands of them, then tens of thousands. Farmers sharing stories. Mechanics confirming they'd have been pressured to push equipment sales. Dealership employees, anonymous, afraid admitting they'd been trained exactly as Stephen described. By Wednesday morning, the story had jumped from agricultural media to mainstream news. CNN ran a segment. NPR did an interview with Sarah and Kenneth. The New York Times picked it up. The Wall Street Journal analyzed the financial implications. John Deere's stock price dropped 3% in one day. Their corporate communications office issued a statement, Wednesday afternoon, carefully worded, acknowledging nothing directly but promising to review inventory management processes to ensure they meet the evolving needs of modern agriculture and maintain our commitment to customer service. But the damage was done. The story had escaped their control. By Thursday, 2 Iowa state representatives had contacted Sarah directly. Both were drafting right-to-repair legislation. Both wanted to use her case as a foundation example. Both asked if she'd testify at committee hearings. Friday brought calls from law firms in Des Moines, Chicago, and Minneapolis. Class action lawsuits were being organized. Farmers across the Midwest were coming forward with similar stories. Would Sarah be willing to serve as a plaintiff? Would Kenneth provide expert witness testimony? Would Stephen Taylor testify about corporate policies and training? Sarah discussed it with Mark that evening. The kitchen table had become their war room, covered with documents and printouts and notes from phone calls and emails that kept coming. This could drag on for years, Mark said. Sarah looked at the papers, at the stories from farmers across the country who'd sent messages after reading Rachel's article, at the USB drive containing evidence that corporate policy had been designed to push people into debt. Then we fight for years. because this isn't just about us anymore. The weeks blurred together after that. David Mitchell sold his combine, took a devastating 60% loss on the resale, but cleared enough debt to prevent foreclosure. He installed the $62 hydraulic valve in his 4440 himself. The tractor ran perfectly. His son, who'd been planning to leave farming for a job in Des Moines, changed his mind, decided the farm was worth fighting for after all. Stephen Taylor spent 2 weeks fielding angry calls from former colleagues who called him a traitor. Then he spent the next month receiving quiet thank you messages from dealership employees across the country who said they'd been waiting for someone to speak up. He started consulting for the coalition that was forming, teaching farmers how to navigate dealer systems, how to find cross-reference parts, how to document refusals. By summer, he'd opened an independent parts supply business specializing in discontinued components. Farmers came from 4 states. Business was surprisingly good. Tom Bradford became one of the coalition's most vocal members. His viral video had done more to expose the issue than any article could have. He used his large operations purchasing power to pressure dealerships into transparency. If they wanted his business for seed and chemicals, they had to commit to selling parts fairly. It worked. 3 dealerships changed their policies within a month. Kenneth started teaching weekend workshops on equipment repair and parts cross-referencing. Emma was his first student. By March, she could diagnose most common tractor problems by sound alone. By April, she'd helped 3 neighboring farmers fix equipment their dealerships had declared beyond repair. By May, she'd started her own notebook, a spiral-bound thing, with a worn cover filling rapidly with entries written in the same careful hand Kenneth used. Katie Martinez approached Emma at school one day in late April. "My dad wanted me to apologize," she said quietly. "He got hit with the same thing on his dealership inventory. The car manufacturers do it too. They restrict parts to push people toward new vehicles." She paused. "He's thinking about joining the coalition, expanding it beyond just farm equipment." Emma looked at the girl who'd made her feel small, who'd made her ashamed of her family's old equipment. "Tell him he's welcome." The Iowa Farmers Equipment Rights Coalition grew rapidly. By summer, it had 200 members across 5 states. The shared database held 600 documented part cross-references. Farmers uploaded their own discoveries, creating a crowdsourced catalog that corporations couldn't control. 3 state right-to-repair bills advanced through committee processes, all citing Sarah's case as foundational evidence. 2 passed by August. Federal legislation was being drafted. John Deere quietly introduced what they called a Legacy Equipment Parts Access Program in June. The details were vague and the restrictions numerous, but it acknowledged without admitting wrongdoing that parts access had been problematic. They also announced they were reviewing their catalog management systems and enhancing training for dealer personnel. More importantly, they removed Stephen Taylor from their industry blacklist and issued a statement that he'd resigned in good standing. A small gesture, but one that mattered. The lawsuits moved forward. Discovery revealed more internal documents, more evidence of systematic policies designed to push replacement over repair. Settlements were discussed. Some farmers took them. Others, including David and Sarah, insisted on going to trial. They wanted the truth on public record, not hidden behind confidential settlement agreements. February 2026 arrived with the same cold that had brought February 2025. 1 year since the injector nozzle wore through. 1 year since Sarah walked into a dealership and was told a part didn't exist. 1 year since a fight began that spread farther than anyone expected. The 4020 had run 580 hours since the repair. 0 problems, 0 failures, maintenance performed on schedule. A machine proving every day that planned obsolescence was a choice, not an inevitability. Sarah stood in the workshop one evening watching Emma work on Andrew Jackson's tractor. The girl had diagnosed a shift fork issue that the dealership had declared a full transmission failure requiring complete replacement. $11,000 versus $180 for the fork. Emma had the transmission partially disassembled, her movements confident and precise. She'd learned not just from Kenneth's technical instruction, but from watching her mother stand up to a system that said ordinary people couldn't win. Scoring here shows the wear pattern, Emma explained to Andrew, who was watching over her shoulder. Forks the problem, not the gear set. Simple fix. Andrew shook his head in wonder. Dealership wanted me to trade the whole tractor in. Said parts weren't available for equipment this old. Emma didn't look up from her work. They always say that. Then you find the cross-reference and discover the parts sitting in their warehouse under a different number. She pointed to her notebook open on the workbench. It's all documented. Everything they claim doesn't exist, we prove does. Kenneth had taught her well, not just mechanics, but skepticism, healthy distrust of systems claiming impossibility. The understanding that can't be done often meant we don't want to do it. The coalition meeting in June brought unexpected attendance. 200 farmers packed the co-op's meeting hall. State agricultural officials came, legislative aides, lawyers working on class action cases, reporters from agricultural journals and mainstream media. What had started as 12 farmers demanding parts had become a movement challenging the fundamental relationship between manufacturers and equipment owners. Sarah found herself speaking to groups regularly, now telling the story, explaining the injector nozzle, the dealership refusal, Kenneth's documentation, the confrontation that revealed hidden inventory. Every time she told it, she saw faces in the audience recognize their own experiences. Parts they'd been told didn't exist. Debt they'd taken on because they believed the lie. Equipment they'd abandoned because they thought it couldn't be fixed. The math was staggering when you added it up. If 10,000 farmers had been pushed into unnecessary debt over the past decade, and the evidence suggested the number was much higher, that represented billions in interest payments alone. Revenue extracted from rural communities and funneled to corporate shareholders. And the companies had profited twice, once on the equipment sale, again on the financing. Christmas 2025 brought an unexpected package to the Williams farm. No return address, but a note inside. To Emma, knowledge written down lasts longer than memory. Use it well. KL. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, blank pages waiting to be filled. Identical to Kenneth's original, which he guarded carefully. Emma's first entries that day included the shift fork replacement specifications from Andrew's tractor, the torque values for the injector nozzle on the 402, cross-references for 3 parts she'd helped locate through the coalition database. The beginning of her own record, her own contribution to collective knowledge that corporations couldn't erase or monetize or lock behind proprietary systems. February 2026 marked the 1-year anniversary. Sarah started the 4020 on a morning that felt identical to the one a year ago. Cold, clear, the kind of February dawn that made you question why anyone farmed in Iowa. But the engine caught on the first turn of the key and settled into the rhythm that meant everything was right. The clean diesel sound that she'd known for 30 years, interrupted only briefly by a worn nozzle that cost $47 to replace. 580 hours since the repair. 31 years of total service. A machine that had been worth more broken than running according to corporate calculations, but was running anyway because someone had refused to accept impossibility. The coalition had grown to 300 members across 8 states. The shared database held over 900 part cross-references. 5 state right-to-repair bills had advanced to floor votes. 2 had passed and been signed into law. Federal legislation was being drafted with bipartisan support. John Deere's stock price had recovered somewhat, but every earnings call now included questions from shareholders about repair restrictions and parts availability. The market was demanding transparency. Consumer pressure was forcing change. The Greenfield dealership saw management changes. Jason Cole had left for a position in Minnesota before the story broke. Kensington lasted 3 months before transferring to a corporate role in Illinois that was technically a promotion, but felt more like exile. The new manager was younger, more careful, and acutely aware that every customer interaction might end up documented in a newspaper article or legislative testimony. Parts that had been discontinued suddenly became available through special order. Turnaround times improved dramatically. Sarah received regular requests to speak at agricultural conferences, equipment shows, legislative hearings. She turned down most of them. She was a farmer, not an activist. The fight had found her, not the other way around. But she accepted enough invitations to keep the story alive, to make sure people understood that repair wasn't a privilege granted by manufacturers, but a right that came with ownership. That knowledge was power, that systems could be challenged. One evening in late spring, she found herself at the kitchen table with Mark looking at the mortgage papers they'd paid off 3 years ago. The farm was theirs, free and clear. No debt, no payments, no corporate entities with leverage over their operation. "We almost lost this," Mark said quietly. "We didn't, though, because we asked the right questions." Emma appeared in the doorway, Kenneth's gifted notebook under her arm. She'd been in the workshop making entries about a repair she'd helped complete that afternoon. The pages were filling steadily, knowledge, accumulating, the chain unbroken. "Mom, Mr. Peterson wants to know if I can look at his planter next weekend. Dealership told him the computer module failed. Replacement would be $3,000. Sarah smiled. "What do you think?" "I think computer modules don't fail as often as sensors feeding them bad data. And sensors cost about $40. Emma grinned. "Also think Mr. Peterson should document the refusal and add it to the coalition database." The girl understood. Not just mechanics, but economics. Not just how machines worked, but how systems tried to prevent people from understanding how machines worked. At 16, she'd learned lessons most people never learn. That knowledge was power, that independence required constant defense, that corporations calling something impossible just meant they didn't want you to try, that ordinary people, when they stood together and refused to accept lies, could change systems designed by billions of dollars and decades of corporate policy. The 4020 sat in the shed ready for tomorrow's work, 54 years old, running perfectly, worth more broken than running according to the calculations that had been designed to push farmers into debt, but running anyway because one woman had refused to believe a part didn't exist when common sense said it had to. On a warm evening in June, Sarah drove out to the cemetery. Her father's grave sat under an oak tree, the headstone worn by 36 years of Iowa weather. She knelt and placed two things at its base: the letter he had written before he died and a receipt for one injector nozzle, part number AB1621R, $47. "You were wrong, Dad," she said quietly. "They don't always win, not if you refuse to let them." She stood, brushed dirt from her knees, and looked at the oak tree. It had been small when they'd buried him. Now it towered overhead, branches spreading wide, growing despite the storms, despite the droughts, despite everything that tried to break it. Like the farm, like the tractor, like the knowledge being passed down through Emma's notebook. She drove back as the sun was setting, painting the Iowa fields gold. At the farm, Mark was making dinner. Emma sat at the kitchen table with her homework, Kenneth's notebook open beside her. The sound of the 4020 drifted in from the shed where she'd left it idling while she grabbed tools for tomorrow's work. Sarah stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. This was what her father had wanted, what he'd lost, what he'd told her not to lose. And she hadn't. The phone rang. Mark answered, then held it out to her. "It's a farmer from Montana, saw your story, having the same problem with a different manufacturer." Sarah took the phone, listened to the story, different company, different part, same pattern of denial and pressure to buy new equipment. "Here's what you need to do," she said. "First, document everything. Every conversation, every refusal. Second, find someone who knows the industry from the inside. Someone who can tell you where those parts really are. Third, don't do this alone. Find other farmers who've been told the same lie." She talked for 20 minutes, walking the farmer through the process that had started with her own worn injector nozzle. When she hung up, Emma was watching her. "How many people have called like that?" 43 since the story broke, from 18 states. "Are you going to help all of them?" Sarah looked at her daughter, 15 years old when this started, 16 now, learning not just how to fix tractors, but how to fix systems. "As many as I can, but eventually they'll help each other. That's how movements work. You light one match, it lights another and another until there's enough light that the darkness can't hide the truth anymore." Emma nodded slowly, understanding. Then she turned back to her notebook and made another entry documenting the Montana farmer's part number, adding it to the growing database of knowledge that corporations couldn't control. Outside, the Iowa night was quiet except for wind through the fields and the distant sound of Highway 20 carrying traffic toward destinations unknown. The farm was paid for, the tractor was running, the knowledge was preserved in workshop notebooks, in coalition databases, in legislative testimonies, in farmers' memories across 20 states and growing. And in the shed, the 4020 sat waiting for tomorrow. 54 years old, a machine that proved every day that the world didn't have to work the way corporations said it did. That parts didn't have to disappear just because a computer screen said so. That debt wasn't inevitable just because a salesman said it was. That ordinary people, farmers, engineers, teenagers, learning to read micrometers, could challenge systems built by billions and win. The part had existed all along. They just made it impossible to find until someone refused to stop looking. And now across the country, farmers were learning to look, to question, to document, to stand together and demand the simple right to fix what they owned. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time in decades, it felt like a fight that could be won. Sarah walked out to the shed and killed the 4020's engine, ran her hand across the hood, feeling the warmth of metal that had absorbed a day's worth of sunlight. "Good job," she whispered to the machine. "We'll do it again tomorrow." She turned off the lights and headed back to the house where her family waited, where her daughter was filling a notebook with knowledge that would outlast them all, where the future was being built one repair at a time. And somewhere she hoped her father was watching, understanding finally that the fight he'd lost hadn't been lost forever, that it had just been waiting for someone who refused to give up. Someone who understood that the most important part, the one that made everything else possible, wasn't in any catalog or warehouse. It was the part inside people that said, "This isn't right, this has to change, and I'm going to do something about it." That part at least would never be discontinued.